Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1179th New Social Environment. I'm Min, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Roddy Schrock and Charlotte Kent. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Roddy Schrock is a nonprofit leader and arts organizer who specializes in building institutional capacity and conceives and implements programs that elevate artists in society. As the Executive Director of Eyebeam, he guides its focus to realign societal relationships with emergent technologies through innovative programs and ambitious fundraising. He also hosts Informer, a podcast featuring casual conversations with leading artists, technologists, and thinkers. And our host today, Associate Professor of Visual Culture at Montclair State University, Dr. Charlotte Kent has a particular interest in historical frameworks for art practices, with a research focus on contemporary digital culture and the absurd. She writes for assorted magazines and various academic journals. She is an editor-at-large at the Broken Rail. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Charlotte to get us started.
Thank you, Min, and welcome everyone. Roddy, thank you so much for joining us. I have I almost don't even know where to begin because I feel like I've been thinking about iBeam for so long, and then yet we just met, but then we immediately just sort of launched into it. Min, I wonder if you'd put up the first slide. This sort of winds up being a kind of perfect introductory image because of the way in which there's all these different component parts. You see the wires and so forth. And one of the things that I had been thinking about and talking with Roddy about in advance of this conversation was just how valuable it is to have a space for critical and creative exploration. There's so much in our world today that feels like we have to have ready answers and that we have to have already established what the outcome is going to be. And so maybe I'm saying that as a bit of a warning of the kind of free-ranging conversation that we're likely to have. One of the great things about a space like iBeam is the way in which it supports artists and journalists and thinkers and curators and people across the arts to explore and think through the challenges of art and technology. These platforms, these softwares, these systems that can feel so constrained and given to us as is. When we engage with them, we get to maybe produce a little bit of creative misuse. And so with that, I am so excited for some of the ways that Roddy can share with us the beautiful long history of iBeam, and talk a bit about his own path to getting there. So hi, and iBeam's been around for 20 or so years, but you have your particular way there. What got you involved with iBeam?
So yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and just thanks to the Rail for introducing this conversation today. It's really just a pleasure to be able to talk about the work that we've done at iBeam and are doing, and to just bring more visibility to some of the artists that we work with. So this is a really, really great opportunity. And I for me, I my background is as an artist and as a digital artist and sound artist. I studied at Mills College and lived in different parts of the world at different times in my life, as an active artist myself. And I think more and more as I kind of moved through the world and got connected with organizations like Stein in Amsterdam, may it rest in peace. But beautiful, important organizations that were dedicated to supporting experimental work really at the fringes of what at that time felt like a wide open new vista of potentiality around technology. And this is before it became quite as commodified as it is now. But there was just like a sense of kind of wonder at what could be in the world and what one could make if they had access to some of these emerging tools. Suddenly, really high level computing technology was affordable, so you didn't have to have a pass, to an underground layer at MIT or something along those lines to be able to experiment. And there was a whole global network of organizations, and still is, happily to some degree, of organizations that were really dedicated to allowing artists in particular, people who could actually kind of crack open and play with technology without an expectation for instant commodification, with the goal of thinking about what technology could be in service to human imagination. And that felt really radical. And in an interesting way, I think in this particular moment, it actually feels even more radical in retrospect than it even did at that time. So that was my background, was being very much involved with several performance groups and organizations that were doing um, very, very interesting work at that time. And I was living in San Francisco working with a nonprofit in Silicon Valley that was launching a digital arts program and helping them out with that. Knew I wanted to live in New York forever. An opportunity opened up at Eyebeam to run their residency program, and happily was invited to help build the residency and fellowship program at Eyebeam. This is like, 15 years ago at this point. And then I've been in the current position as executive director for the last 10 years. And it's been an inspiring, glorious run of adventure for that whole period. It's an exciting, lively organization, and
Yeah.
it's
I mean, I think one of the things that you bring up, right, in the sort of even talking about your own travels and sort of, moving around and it's even just one of the topics that's maybe central to IBEAM is like what is human about technology, right? Um, Especially because in the popular imagination, technology feels alien. It feels as if it's not human. And it's often positioned that way. It's this sort of like more than human. Um, it's this prosthetic. It's, these various different things. And I think, so much about the fact that uh, technology is, I mean, language is a technology, right? It's been spoken about that way for so long. It's technologies are the ways in which we make the world and ways of knowing what we're experiencing. And this particular machine formation is just one of them. It has a strong line to the human. And so this idea of, we're looking here at this, what are the values of your world? Um, it's, I think it's one of the things that, an organization like IB, like so many of the things that you're talking about, try and connect, right? Try and connect that and bring it back to the sort of general audience understanding. Um, we're here right now because this was this really important moment, speaking of human and technology and connection and disconnection. Um, when in 2020, as we all remember, because in fact, not only that, like our new social environments at the Brooklyn Rail were launched in the context of the global pandemic as a way to get us to continue to connect and be in conversation even through these screens and to have critical but funny conversations where we could explore ideas together. So when this moment happened, you all flipped. Do you want to describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was a moment that brought immediate challenges in so many ways. And right, I had actually been on sabbatical until February of 2020. Came back, we were preparing to launch our residency the next month. Which would typically bring artists to our physical space, which at that time was in Bushwick, and come together in person and so forth. The pandemic began happening, and we sort of had a choice. We either just put everything on pause, or we sort of go into a responsive series of activities that would allow us to continue to work with artists and to support artists in a new way, try and experiment, see where it goes. And we essentially just said, okay, let's do it. Well, and we began holding, not totally dissimilar to some of the work that you all have done. We ended up holding Friday afternoon gatherings for everyone in our community to hear from them about what they needed. Um, to get feedback on what kind of residency might make sense in the kind of emerging world that was showing up. And we launched what we ended up calling Rapid Response for a Better Digital Future. And the idea behind that was we wanted to support work that would help us exit surveillance capitalism, which was what we called it 5 years ago. And uh, and it really was a chance for a group of artists, in this case, literally around the world, to find community, find support with each other through Eyebeam as a hub, but more as a connector. We offer direct financial resources to everyone who participates. And we ended up supporting 30 artists through this program due to the support of several major foundations that came through and really stepped up to make that possible. And it produced some very significant outcomes. And I would say, in many ways, it really changed the way that we thought about residencies and fellowships as an organization. And since that time, we have been moving more into a digital first practice with the understanding that in-person gathering is still very much necessary and organizing that through partnerships with other organizations. But yeah, the Rapid Response Program feels like it was a really it was a turning point, for so many people, but for us, it just shifted notions about what we could focus on, how we could focus on it, and now bring together more of even a global network of practitioners.
I mean, it's interesting that you said this sort of digital first, because I would have actually said, I'm not sure. I mean, I think one of the things that you're pointing out is, um, digital is a part of it, but one of the things that I think came through that we've continued to talk about and is why the NSC continues is um, this notion of community, this notion of the fact that even though we all need alone time, right? Like especially, as a part of a creative process or a research process, like you need time to reflect and to not hear all the other voices, but you also need to be in conversation. And so I think there was this kind of, for me in some ways, like I've been thinking a lot about the way there was this kind of divide, right? There was like digital community, and then there was like in-person community, and these two things were separate. And now part of what I think many people have talked about is like the way in which that's woven, right? People will have, especially in the last few years, like have really made connections. There's even people on here whom I've not, who are in our audience today, whom I've never met in person, but that I feel a kind of relationship to because I've seen them on the NSC, when I'm in the audience or because they're in an audience with me. Um, and so our understanding of community has started to shift. And I feel like I think one of the things I want to ask you is like, in these conversations, you were figuring out what a new kind of community was going to be like.
I appreciate you saying that. In some ways, I feel like we haven't even we've made a lot of moves so quickly. In some ways, we're still digesting how to think about those. I think what you're saying really resonates so deeply because, I mean, and to this day, we partner with other arts organizations in Korea and other parts of the world, and we'll have artists who will just have Zoom on in their studio while they're working and not even talking to each other, but just the knowledge that there is another person in the room with them changes the way that they work. And I'm so fascinated by that, and I think like that.
Yeah, I mean, even as a writer, like I've had moments where I've set up, writing hours with people, and the whole thing is like we get on Zoom together. Like the video is on, but it's
Yeah,
silent. We're not talking to each other. We're just committed to writing together for a period of
yeah,
time, to reinforce a kind of commitment to
yeah.
ourselves, other. Yeah.
And and I think there's such a strength to those kinds of bonds, and it's different. It's a different kind of, I think anyway, it's a different kind of bond, but it's no less meaningful. And what we learned is that if we bring our artists together, even just for a few days during the fellowship period, and have a few meals together, that actually really, kind of satiates 80% of the need, for kind of like spending
Mhm.
together during the fellowship period. I mean, people are like, wait, that's enough. We got to spend a week together in person, and we spend the rest of the months, hanging out online, and that feels great. And then they connect in person, and as their careers evolve and so forth. But that was a real learning for us that and there's something very beautiful about
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something I'll be curious, in the years to come, like as we're all still exploring this. I mean, I think it's really,
that.
really important. I've been thinking about this so much, and maybe it's because of everything that's going on in the world and all the shifts that are happening. But this kind of recognition of the fact that we're still figuring out so many things.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and, you know, it wouldn't be possible to have some of the international collaborations that to have artists from around the world together in this kind of way if it weren't for some of this stuff. Um, and I'm thinking about even, the types of partnerships that you've started to develop that are so international. And it's not to say that, some of that wasn't there before, but it feels like there's a new interest and a new emphasis on really making sure that there's
Yeah,
global connectivity in a meaningful, creative, critical way, as opposed to just global connectivity because we're wired together.
yeah. And it's very intentional, and a lot of this is us in working to create family through intentionality outside of, say, the dictates of an algorithm or a another method of sort of a lot of our artists are very, very focused on the ways in which technology has the potential to be very manipulative. Both in terms of the community that we associate with as well as our inner lives. And I think that the more that as an organization, even one our size, the more that we very intentionally create a bond with a very different type of working group or a very different socio-political location, or that only helps us kind of break out of some of the dictates of very strategically developed sort of corporate technology that we're all engaged in. And and I think, yeah, I mean, I feel like if I use the phrase, now more than ever, one more time, my head is gonna explode or something. But it does feel really important. It feels really important to make sure that we are
I just
using,
realized, Rob,
yeah.
that we're talking about these partnerships and we haven't mentioned, like, actually identified them for the audience. So I'm just going to back myself up. That's my fault. Can you actually, I mean, I know there's the one with Art Lab in Seoul, Korea. Can you just sort of describe that one in particular? Because it's significant right now, but,
Sure. So we're working with Art Lab in Korea. We've been working with them for about four, I guess, going on 5 years now. For the V, there's a very, very interesting and important award that Art Lab organizes, that platforms emerging Asian artists working in media and technology, and it's called the VH Award. And then through a group of jurors, the finalists get to be in residence at Eyebeam for a period along with our fellows. And then we work on professional development opportunities, technological access as much as possible, et cetera, to help support them. And then there's one winner from the finalists whose work is shown in Seoul in exhibition, and potentially with a gallery that they have relationships with as well. But that to me is just such a great program, and every year that we do it, it just never fails to remind me of the importance of just maintaining as much as possible perspective on the world outside of the one that we face in the United States. And that's just one example. We also work very closely with Lebec in Switzerland. Uh, their residency call is actually currently open. They're a fantastic arts residency. Tends to focus on artists that are working in relationship to ecology or nature, but very much in line with emerging technology. And I think obviously those connections are just becoming more and more enmeshed between our ecological realities and the technologies that we use.
and an
And
awareness, right? That technology is also material. It's the cloud
yeah,
is skeuomorphism, if you will.
yeah, yeah. The cloud is, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a very material thing. It's very expensive and it uses a lot of energy. So.
It's, I guess I'll just put a plug in here for a moment. For Mia Stern wrote a piece for the Rail last summer, specifically about the cloud, and the materiality of the cloud, and the way artists themselves have been trying to materialize that materiality for people for several decades, and how important that's been.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's one of the reasons, for something, for an organization like Eyebeam, and thinking about like it's it's sort of early beginnings, and why artists have always been important in this field, because um, the tinkering that they get to do sort of unpacks the system.
Yeah, and I think it's really it's maybe it's too strong a word, but it's a revelatory practice, it's all about the tinkering that you're pointing to unveils often hidden realities that many of us don't necessarily have access to. And it's not as mysterious as I'm making it sound. It's usually pretty, it's there's usually an effort to make some of those things seem mysterious. But when you actually, dig into it, you learn that it's a system and it has rules. And as you know very well, Charlotte, when you start digging into those rules, there's a complexity to it, but it's a knowable, system. And I think just there's such a yeah, I think artists are just kind of naturally the right people to just kind of poke into what the machine is hiding and sort of help us understand it. And then I think also to act as a translator, to be able to help communicate or put into visual form or sonic form,
Oh, yeah.
experiential form. Yeah.
I mean, I will always remember that when I first became interested in this weird new technology thing called blockchain, I read about it. I read sort of like how the things worked. And it wasn't until I started seeing some of the art projects that were made, really between like 2016 and 2020, that I started to understand actually what was going on. Because just that little bit of visualization, right? Just that little bit of sort of um, extracting the code, the software, the lines of association into something, made then what I had been reading about it make sense. Right?
Oh, I know. I know. I mean, it's so true. And you start to take it for granted when you start working with artists that are doing that's like, oh, we have access to that. They can help us. Um,
And similarly, I think with this sort of international strain that you're talking about, right? Um,
really.
it's, I think I'm aware of it, particularly right now. I was just in Japan, and it's a place I'd always wanted to go, and I'd read about it and stuff like that. Um, but talking to artists who were there was really different than reading, like than just sort of trying to picture the context in which they were, right? Like the way they talked about their practices, seeing the neighborhoods they lived in, um, and for myself, then trying to like manage the difference between the vision I had of a place like Japan or a place like Korea, right, where there's so much sort of visual um, context for the ideas that we have of these places, and then actually to be in conversation and wait, you use this word, what do you mean by that? Like, oh, is that this, right? And starting to bring that out and being able to see works from around the world has really been making me think about how, yes, on one hand, there's these technologies that are transnational, right? Like Microsoft Word is Microsoft Word, whether you're here or in Tokyo or Seoul, or Paris. On the other hand, things change, right?
Oh, I know. I'm so glad you're talking about that. I mean, and I think you're articulating something that I actually struggle to articulate sometimes, which is just the sense of uh just the feeling that technology is so plastic in terms of its connectivity to like culture and it's, in the meaning that it has in America, a technology, however you define that. is just going to be so radically different in a place where the needs of the people are different or the history is different, and you start to see it used. And I mean, AI is a great example of some of the projects that we've observed in this collaboration with Art Lab in Korea, in the way that some of the artists in other parts of the world are thinking about AI is just from such a different perspective that it almost feels like it's a different technology than what we're calling AI. And I think there's that's to me that like is a it's a ray of light that gives me some hope that there are ways of even in 2025 we still have some agency in how we can manipulate and think about it. Because at the end of the day, like our response to it is really the only thing that matters. So it's
Yeah. I mean, I think it was really interesting during the College Art Association a couple of weeks ago, doing a Q&A after a panel that was talking about these various like text to image, video, sound generators and so forth. The Q&A had really veered into the anxiety and fears, and they are rightly placed, right? Like I want to be very, very clear. There's no doubt that there's a whole
yeah,
lot of dangers sociopolitically with some of the way in which these are infiltrating um, our society. But one of the people on the panel said, and I'm gonna, sort of lightly paraphrase, nowhere do I hear such fear about this technology than in the wealthiest, most privileged nation in the world. In other parts of the world, people don't assume that the technology they're given is ready-made for them. They think they're going to have to hack it and break it and do things to it to make it adapt to them. Um, and having just come back from Japan and like having had some of those same sort of conversations, I was so struck by the fact that like, right, that's actually something important to remember. Um, because of infrastructure challenges, because of cultural needs, there's a widespread attitude of just like, oh, you gave me this, like, meh, 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 I'm gonna like do things to
yeah,
it.
I know. I hear you. I mean it's so oh yeah, I don't even know where to start. I mean what we're looking at right now, Heather Dewey Hagborg's Stranger Visions project. I mean, that's such a great example. And I remember when she started that at Eyebeam. So essentially what she would do, and this was like, goodness, 2012, 2013, something. I don't know. It's all a blur. But she would go take DNA samples of random strangers from around New York City and would use essentially off-the-shelf technology to generate sculptural kind of approximations of this person's DNA. So she would find a piece of bubble gum or a hair, and analyze it, and then build a facial sculpture from that technology. And was it accurate? Was it not accurate? Who knows? But at the same time, it was a technology that was starting to be used by police in New York City and law enforcement to sort of, determine one's guilt in crime. And so, when she did this project, I don't think anybody, even at IBM, everybody's like, what are you talking about? This stuff can't be like, is this really happening? So there's always this kind of element of like, this technology sort of like coming into our lives, and someone like Heather, in this case, pointing out the potential dangers of the technology. And, I don't, I mean, I wonder how it is in other places sometimes, but I do feel like in the United States, that as you were pointing to maybe a little bit, there is this tendency to sort of receive technology as a ready-made thing. It was kind of what I was hearing, some of what you were saying at least, was that there's this element of kind of an acceptance of the thing as a package, and then we incorporate it and we, put criminals in jail because of its technology. We trust it. And maybe it's that trust issue that we have here that just kind of is like just overwrought. It's like it's but I don't know. But at the same time, one of the beautiful things that someone like Heather is also doing is pointing to the technology itself through a kind of kind of through a refraction through these sculptural masks that she's building, and it really to me was a great example of someone who was actually creating almost like through an educational process, helping create awareness of the technology that is starting to appear around us in hopes for its better usage. But
I
there's
was gonna say, it feels like, I mean, this is one of the things speculative design has, been doing. It's
yeah,
There's a sort of moment with like the interest in speculative design um, parallels the uh, proliferation of sort of I'm gonna call them consumer technologies, right? Just like the general sort of like since the 90s of just having them as a part of our lives. And I think this there's a way in which speculative design as a creative practice, and many of the artists who are involved in art, like that we put under sort of art and technology umbrellas, are often doing some of that.
absolutely. Yeah, hugely so. Huge. I mean, and very interesting work. You know, you may be familiar with the work of Chris Webkin or uh, some of his past collaborators, and uh, to me, some of the work that they were doing in the mid 2000s was like deeply prescient work actually, and it was at that time it was speculative, and now it's reality. And I'm like, oh, that wasn't supposed to that we weren't supposed to go that way. You were warning us. Like, but there's as you said, I mean, there's a beautiful, rich history of practice in that realm, and it almost takes the form of a kind of research journalism or something in terms of its the way that it plays out in the world, which is sometimes tricky for an organization that ostensibly is an art organization. Um, there are gulfs to be crossed on occasion in those kinds of
I'm
practice.
sure. And I was going to say, I mean, I think one of the other types of kind of partnerships or that have come up is like these partnerships with other foundations, other organizations, right? That's also a type of research practice, but from a sort of institutional level.
Yeah.
And so just to have you put on your executive director hat for a moment, right? I mean, I feel like often when, an organization partners with another one or, does something together, there's a sense of like, oh, well, that's again, a sort of ready-made thing, as opposed to maybe like this organization and that organization are going to figure out what it's like to work together. Can you speak a little bit just in your own experience about how
Yeah.
IBEAM's research practice of partnerships has worked?
Was sort of a R&D lab for hire, but only with people that we like. But I mean, it's really fascinating, honestly, to have to be in, yeah, to be in an executive director kind of position of an organization like this that sort of has in its DNA this um, resistance to a clear boundary between what we do and what we don't do. And the kind of tensions that arise from that, I've only found to be productive, So, um, and I think the great thing is a lot of the work that the organization has been doing long before I was ever, part of it, is more and more, realized as an important an important practice worthy of investment. And I think that's seen more and more by both foundations, by academic institutions, and obviously many academic institutions invest hugely in their own versions of kind of creative research slash practice. And so there's the model is super fascinating, and it's I think, but I think at the end of the day, as long as we're, being true to uh, the artists that we work with and providing a ground for them, uh, that's really the goal. I mean, we truly are, an artist support organization is what we are, and it just happens to be that we're working with technology. There was one slide when this was shared with me that I did find really fascinating, and I'd actually never seen a shot of it. There's the terminal interface down at the bottom, I think, of a Corey Archangel, Mike Fruman piece called Pizza Party. Um, And this was before my time, but it just came to mind in terms of kind of the prescience of Eyebeam artists. They would hack into, I think it was yeah, it was Domino's. They actually hacked into Domino's system in, I don't know, 2000 or something like that. And they set up this interface. Oh, sorry, 2004. And they set up this interface that would allow people to have pizzas delivered, by typing in a few keywords in the terminal. Um, and this, yeah, obviously, this is before Seamless. But this kind of, I love the fact that you use the word tinkering, because to me, this is just such a great example of artists kind of getting in the machine, tinkering, and playing and having a party, uh, and at the same time, really kind of stumbling, in some cases maybe even accidentally, on realities that are soon going to have bearing in how we all live. But yes, thank you for finding this shot of the terminal. That's actually pretty fun. So
Well, it's also just it's such a funny moment because I often have been recently doing this thing where I try to remember what I used to do before X app or before X service or whatever it is, right? That moment when I remember I used to have to, ask of, I'd go visit a friend and ask, what's your nearby car service? Because if I was out here in Bushwick or in parts of New York where like taxis were not going to be available late at night, but I would need one to get home, I couldn't call the one near me wherever I live. I needed one nearby, right? So I'd have to get the car service of my friend's local place, right? Because there wasn't Uber, there wasn't Lyft, there wasn't these other types of things. And just remembering like that wasn't that long ago, right? And like these little shifts that have happened. Like now we order everything online. We used to call for pizza and get a business signal sometimes.
exactly right. Exactly. I know. Yeah. But I do think that's an interesting thing to point out, is the fact that in the big scheme of things, 21 years ago wasn't that long. Um,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Anyway.
I'm wondering just because of all this and because it's sort of fun to walk along this line of the sort of the anxiety and the creativity moving back and forth. You have this fellowship called the Democracy Machine. And obviously, right now, those two words together create a certain degree of anxiety. Um, but it's but the artists who are involved are, really trying to think through what the machine itself of democracy is, right? Like what is the structure? What are the gears and the code that produce democracy? So I'm just wondering if you could speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, this was where we, as an institution, decided to take another risk. We, following the Rapid Response Fellowship, we realized that there's a potential for uh, even greater sort of agency to be given to artists in developing their own fellowship program in some ways. Um, with things happening online, with people working more and more digitally, it just seemed a very exciting time to try something new. So what we did was we reached out to, I think, about 20 trusted advisors, friends of the organization, in other organizations, and so forth, and we asked them to nominate five artists who could participate in the first sequence of the Democracy Machine 3-year fellowship. So it was always intended to be a 3-year program. And so they nominated fantastic people. We went through a review process and invited them to join, along with two mentors who would work with us over the whole 3-year period and provide continuity to the 3-year fellowship. So every artist receives $20,000 at minimum, and access to all of our network professional development opportunities, and sort of the suite of kind of support that we provide at iBeam. And what was really even more unique about this was each group would then decide on, democratically decide on who the next group of artists would be for each subsequent year. and we would increase the number each year as much as possible, pending funding. And it was, I mentioned this to you yesterday, Charlotte. I mean, in some ways, I know there have been other organizations who have done kind of similar things in the sense of providing agency to artists, performance space, and other organizations have gone down this road. And I think for us, it was really a really unique opportunity to experiment on an organizational level. And it's something that in many ways we are still kind of thinking about and collecting the documentation of and trying to figure out how to feed back what we've learned from that process to the field, because we do intend it to be something that ideally can provide learning for the field at large. And um, it's it does what I absolutely love about that particular program is that it brings to into relief um, how decisions are made. Whether it's, and sometimes that can be a little uncomfortable, and that's okay, and ideally, we're able to accommodate those tensions and help smooth them over as much as possible. And help everyone become more aware of um, what it means to have collective decision making in an organizational environment. So I feel very, very positive about that process and that program in the sense of the learning that it's brought to the organization. And now that we are digesting that, considering how we can learn from that and continue to go forward. And it I will say, and I mentioned this to you as well, that when we launched this program, I don't think we saw the kind of the socio-political landscape shifting in the ways that it has, and it gave a kind of poignance to the program that we may not have even anticipated when we were first talking about it. But it was intended to be provocative, and it was intended to be an experiment, and it was very much. I think it's been very successful in helping us uh, institutionally consider what it means to be the kind of open organization that we try to be, And yeah, it's been fascinating.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, I know a few of the artists who are involved, by reputation or in person, and but I mean, clearly all of them are um, ones whose own practice in one way or another has had these questions of how does democracy work, right? What is a democratic practice? What does democracy even mean to me? How is that distinct from um, social collectives? How is that, how does the individual sit within the community? To what, to what extent does the individual produce the community or produce the individual? Um, and, uh, and experimenting with that, right? And because we are living through a moment where I think those questions are very real. And there's been, I mean, political scientists have talked about the way in which the loss of, civics education in schools, right? And that was decades ago. The way in which access to, even local community boards is so, can feel for many people very difficult to get at, right? Like, how do you know what's happening at the most local level if you can't figure out who's making some of those decisions?
Yeah.
How do you ask for more trash cans in your neighborhood? Like, where do you that? Like, right? I mean, that's something I spent a lot of time a few years ago trying to track down, and it turns out it was so difficult. There was no place I could find that information. But it's like these are things that many political scientists have said are contribute to the lack of trust in political governance, that contribute to the lack of trust um, in each other because no one knows and then no one knows how to access. And so these types of experimentations, I think, try and unpack, well, what could we do in the world that we live in today that is somewhat different from the one 100 years ago or 250 years ago
Yeah.
to bring up um, what shared responsibility for the success of the socio-political context can look like.
Yeah. And I am of the mind that in the same way that the way that artists bring an ideal of experimentation to their practice, interrogating social structures, whether it be democracy, whether it be, technology, and our relationship to it, there's such an important role, I think, for artists that are, attracted to that, to be involved. I mean, um, I- the I feel like there's still so much untapped potential for an elevation of artists' thinking in relationship to so many of the things that you're just pointing out. And I hope, organizations like Eyebeam and others can be a way to sort of model that. And in an ideal world, we would be able to sort of show, how you can experiment with these ideas institutionally, and you can then show your work afterwards, which is kind of the phase we're at now, is figuring out how to kind of package this and present it a little more publicly. And that actually can be of benefit to the field. And ideally, just for people that are curious, people that would like to learn about new ways of approaching these things. I mean, we held a gathering last month. This was a private gathering, and my hope is that it could potentially grow into more of a public event. But it was specifically geared to bring people together to ask questions about the relationship between art and artificial intelligence. And we invited everyone to turn over their cell phones when they entered the space, which we mostly succeeded on, which was great. We set up a whole day of conversations, literally just conversations, where we would have people sort of guiding the participants, in a loose manner, but to just bring people together to be able to talk to one another about how they are thinking about artificial intelligence. Is we, probably a third of the people were practicing artists who work in art and technology. There were, people from funding organizations. There were people who were just part of the larger community and were curious, alumni of the organization and so forth. And it was kind of, it really was just evidence to me that it just through a lightly structured process that intentionally introduces artists and artists thinking into seemingly kind of intractable issues, like you get to a better place. And it's not like you get everything solved. There's no one answer, but you can leave having better questions. I mean, one of the reasons we did this was because we were so frustrated with just kind of the kinds of questions that were being asked about AI just seemed to be completely missing the point and not really getting anybody to even understand the mechanics of how it works. And there was one person in the audience, Michael Joaquin Gray, who is an artist who was very active in the 80s and 90s around artificial intelligence. And his response was essentially, we're kind of just going through the same thing we went through in the 80s. He's like, these are basically just, these are loops of information, and machines do it really quickly. They do it more quickly now than they did in the 80s, but the process is kind of the same. And that felt really, eye-opening, and to have that kind of insight into it and the discussions around that was very helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the things, it's one of the reasons I always say AI, it's not actually a thing. It's a branding term. It always has been. It's a way of sort of summing up a whole set of different types of technologies and even technologies is not the right word. Like it's the way of summing up like different types of coding, different types of softwares, different stacks that do very different things. And one comes to the sort of media fore for a moment and gets called AI, and all the others sort of fall out of being called AI anymore, right? We were having these conversations around filter bubbles 12 years ago as everyone started to think about how social media there's this algorithmic drive that was, producing our feeds and so forth. But now we don't think of that as AI anymore. Um, all the stuff that
Yeah.
Heather was pointing out, or Zach, and some of the images we've seen so far was also at one point talked about as AI.
Mhm.
Um, and and then, I would just add, like, I think it's interesting when we bring up the conversation around art with whatever that technology of the moment being called AI is, there's a whole nother set of difficulties that arise because, you know, I mean, as the example I always give is like I'm okay with artists using in painting, right? I'm okay with them using Photoshop tools that allow them to alter images. I'm not particularly keen on that in photojournalism. I'm not particularly keen on that in, you know, uh, sort of political dissemination of content from our representatives. I think that that's bad. I'm not okay with that, right? How do we deal with the same tool being used in these very different ways?
Yeah, I hear you.
And
And
you don't have to answer that. That wasn't actually.
good. I
Um,
mean,
I, yeah, go ahead.
what I was gonna say is like yes, 100%. And I think, you know, I think so much of it just goes back to I think it's just that so much of it is just about asking the right questions and artists helping us at least get to the right questions. I do think that everything you just said is I completely agree. And this is, coming from someone who helped launch a journalism program for artists using these tools. But one of the things that they did was I really believe that so much of it comes down to just the context that you build for the presentation of this kind of work. And and that's why I feel like I wish there was like, 1,000 organizations like Eyebeam in the United States, or I wish that there could be um, more organizations dedicated to the kind of work that helps people understand where artists start and stop in terms of their, relationship to technology. Um, and it's unfortunate to see, a little bit like how things are shifting with the NEA going into whatever weird thing the NEA is going into at the moment. And just as a kind of, blurring of boundaries on so many levels of how this work gets funded and why. Um, I think there is a place for we kind of started the conversation with a recollection I had of working in the early 2000s in different kind of arts and technology organizations, in different places. Um, I do think, my dream is that there would be almost a kind of global consortium of organizations dedicated to this kind of work that would actually be able to coordinate with one another and that could actually build a better kind of literacy culturally around these tools. And it goes back to what we started with as well, like this notion of like revealing, how and why it works and what it's actually doing. It's not that complicated, but it shouldn't be. I don't think these things should feel so mysterious. And I think that if there was a more kind of a widespread engagement with this type of work, it would actually help culturally for people to be a little more literate in how they receive technology too.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, part of the, thing, both with the Democracy Machine Fellowship, but also with some of this type of, like, you're right, like wishing for there to be more of these types of spaces is because it's not just that we see what can be done, but we also discover what can't be done.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And
what
there are
it's
limits.
for.
There are real limits.
And that's, I think one of the things, in the way in which research has shifted over, the past many decades with outcomes and like positive outcomes and publishable outcomes and product outcomes becoming so crucial to funding, even being delivered, it undermines the fact that negative results are equally informative.
Yeah.
finding out like in a small context, like one of the fellows maybe, doing a project to show, hey, it doesn't do this thing in this small, like rather than like putting it out there in the world for like it to fail on a massive scale and
Yeah,
devastate many people's lives, like, hey, this doesn't work
yeah,
because these are the failures that impact um, people's lives or people's uh, you know relationships. And so, hey, let's not do that.
right. Right. I could not agree more. And I think that that acknowledgement that failure should be something that sometimes can be celebrated. Like to understand how things cannot work is just it feels so vital. So I appreciate your pointing that out.
I think, I can't help it maybe as a scholar, sort of, the kind of like the contortions one sometimes feels like one has to go through just to be able to be like, oh, this will be the result of this thing that I haven't started, but I say I want to do for the next 5 years. You're going to get this out of it. I mean, 5 years from now, obviously what I think now is exactly what's going to happen, right? Um, and, and the challenges of that. And I think, I'm, and I say that even at a moment when, and I've already said it, but like and I suspect many people feel like we do want answers, right? We do want solutions to the problems that we're facing, and how uncomfortable it is to be sitting through this period of, thinking things through and figuring things out, and the way in which artists and arts practice necessitate that, right? That's a crucial part of.
Yeah. And going back to what we kind of touched on a little bit before too, I think there's, I mean, everybody knows this, but sometimes it's good to just be reminded of it and so forth, is that institutions go through those same pressures. It's very much uh in different ways, but very much similar.
Yeah,
And
you have to apply for funding. You have to apply
have to
for.
apply for funding. Yes. Somebody has to keep the lights on. And luckily, we've been very lucky in that we've had some enlightened funders throughout our history. And, one of them in particular who has seen us through the whole history, who, has been open to the idea that you don't have to have all of the answers immediately. But at the same time, in a city like New York, in the way that arts funding happens in this country, that pressure is a very, very real one. And unfortunately, I think I feel like it would be nice if we could all maybe take it a little less seriously sometimes.
I mean, a- as your local absurdist, obviously I'm going to say like, um, I think taking things a little less seriously is sometimes the best way to be able to also hold the
I
seriousness.
couldn't agree more. I
Um,
absolutely hear you.
just before I hand it back over, I wanted to say, obviously, we've been moving in and out of these different types of relationships and so forth. Right now, Eyebeam doesn't really, my understanding, like, Eyebeam doesn't really have like the hub of the place where you show work or something like that. And with all of these relationships, what are you with no commitments? I'm not asking for you to like commit officially or anything, but like, what are you thinking about the way in which Eyebeam might have a physical space in New York or pop-ups or I don't know, is that something that's
Yeah.
on?
Oh, it absolutely is. And there's so many conversations. My dream, well, I guess maybe this is telling a little bit where I have come from in terms of my own history and practice and so forth, where I've seen so many artists kind of go into quote unquote residency at like major tech corporations and essentially get given a desk and then never heard from again. And it's like it's kind of a joke, but I always had this idea of like how amazing would it be to actually have a dedicated um, space, physical space in New York City, easily gotten to by train, that could essentially kind of flip that script where it would actually be artists working, and then with others. Maybe we want to have a CEO in residence, or maybe we want to have a genetics researcher in residence, or where we could actually, but it would be essentially designed to support artists first and foremost as the experts rather than as the kind of, supplicants, and to then allow access uh, for those who want to learn from artists or want to be a part of that practice. But to have a space for that kind of relationality to me would just be amazing. So if there are any donors on the call that would like to support this long-term vision, but it there I think there's space for that, and honestly I think there's hunger for it. I think there's, my parents, I could pitch this to my parents and they would get it now, and I'm not sure they would have 10 years ago. So I think there's an understanding of that kind of importance. So anyway, yeah, those are the kinds of things that we think about and talk about. The idea of a series of pop-ups and those sorts of approaches is very much something that keeps bubbling up as well. And we'll probably have a lot more to say actually as an organization in the upcoming months around some of our plans that we got. So.
Ooh, I love that. Well, that'll be exciting. Well, I think that, I mean, that's just such a brilliant idea, and I love the way that flips the script, as it were. And I think is a nice note on which to say like that. I feel like that's what IBeam is always doing, sort of is flipping the script and trying to shift the way in which we're thinking about any of the things that we think we're thinking about to explore, to create anew. And with that, it's my responsibility to hand it back over so that other people can ask you questions. Min, back to you.
You both. Our first question's from Paul Hertz. Communities seem like a parasite on commercial social media, which are really intended for data harvesting. What models of networking can support digital communities? As someone online since 1983, I think of how NetTime and other listservs fostered community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. That's such a great question. I really, I think about that a lot too, because we've talked about, do we want an IBeam channel in Discord? Do we want an IBeam channel in these different kind of platforms and so forth? Um, what we have found is that at the end of the day, it really just comes down to the people that we have involved and kind of the goal of whatever community we might be trying to put together. Um, and then we just use whatever tools we have available to kind of support that. That being said, we did commission a design firm out of England a few years ago during the rapid response program to develop a communication system, a presentation system, as well as a whole suite of like shared document folders, kind of a la Google, but outside of corporate surveillance. And and it was pretty amazing what they came up with. It's still like many things at IBeam, it's a little bit of a work in progress. Um, but we've started trying to use it with our Democracy Machine Fellows as well as some of our Rapid Response Fellows. And I don't remember what it's called. I'm happy to provide more information if you want to, if you want to just write to me, or Min, perhaps you could share an email address or whatever, but very accessible. But I'd be happy to share the information about that design group. But it was a custom design kind of internal platform that I think could have a lot of usage in a larger scale as well. But happy to share more, learn more about your experiences as well as someone who's been active in this realm for decades. And, thank you.
If I could kind of just jump in here, I just want to throw out that I'll throw it into the chat, but you all may have been hearing about this thing called the Fediverse. And it's this sort of it's a way of trying to connect all of these different sort of social media excuse me, apps through some open source protocols, and it's basically being presented increasingly as a way to try and resist some of that data harvesting. I'll put a link in the chat to a piece that came out that sort of conversationally walks you through how it works and so forth. I myself, I'm just going to acknowledge I haven't used it yet. I'm still sort of researching, but it seems like an interesting alternative, and it's definitely one that I'm hearing a lot of conversation around.
Yeah.
Our next question is from GE. Could you talk a bit about IBeam's outreach to outsider artists who will never acknowledge institutional criteria, which is such a powerful gesture of resistance? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. And in some ways, that was part of the impetus for us to launch the Democracy Machine project. was to kind of get ourselves out of the way around decision making about who could participate. And we, explicitly invited each subsequent group of artists to bring in who they wanted to bring in. Um, but I realized even just using language like bring in and and not bring in, we're already kind of falling into what the questioner was asking. But I think at least it was an effort to acknowledge that institutions, even smaller ones like Eyebeam, don't always know by any stretch of the imagination, like who would most benefit from our support, who we could most learn from, who would be most helpful to broaden the community. And so it was an effort, at least, to open the door to artists that maybe historically and and admirably would be resistant to institutional engagement. And and as I said before, I mean, we are still learning from that process. There's no, you know, this is not something where we're just like, oh, now we know how to do it. It was an experiment. And but I think that's a really good question and one that we're still, sorting through.
Thank you. And our last question is from me, and I have a question for the both of you. So maybe Roddy, you can answer first, and while Charlotte's answering, you can prepare for the reading afterwards. Um, Something that I picked up during your conversation, was how, or I guess personal reflection as well, how art enables curiosity for technology. I think there's a bit of a room that art creates to ask the right questions, something that I really liked earlier during your conversation, Roddy, you mentioned how there are ways in which you can ask the right questions and ask and kind of formulate questions and continue questioning. And I wanted to ask, what are some of the questions that you're asking? What are you curious about? And what are you looking forward to?
I mean, uh, I think the only questions that interest me are questions that have to do with how humans relate to one another in the world. And I think if technology is part of that, great. But I think if questions are not taking that very, very seriously, then I think it's the wrong question. So I guess to Charlotte's point earlier, I know what questions I don't like. Um, yeah.
I guess I'll say, I hold close the roots of technology, which is to say techne and logos. Techne as a skilled, a craft, a way of making, and logos as a form of reason and type of thinking. Um, and even in just having to say those two things, what wound up happening is the way I said a form of reason, right? A form. It's a making, right? And that the making is a type of knowing, right? There's a deep relationship there between these. Um, and I had to say all of that because there's a thread in contemporary art, which, as many of you know, I take to be 100 years long, that has really invoked sort of a gesture and a creative immediacy and the curiosity of being in the moment that was expressed across, the sort of the use of chance and then the kind of the feeling, the affectiveness that really comes out in some of the expressionism then appears in performance and some of these other types of media that we don't associate, therefore, with art and technology, in part because uh, the when you start to break down a computer, it's scary. There's parts and electricity, and there's, um, you know, neurotoxins and some of the metals and so forth, right? Like, it's not quite the same thing as like feeling so comfortable, even with all the toxins that are in, paints and so forth, right? It's not quite the same thing. Um, and so there's a harnessing of curiosity that requires um, a critical approach that is that often feels like it's different from other art practices. And so I I guess I keep saying like I needed to say all of that so that I could get to the idea that um, it's useful to have both, right? There's a way in which, with technology, there is a kind of planning and execution that becomes necessary in coding, in those things. But we also forget sometimes, and artists will talk about it, like sometimes the way in which they play with the code to see like what will happen, right? There's this kind of like, oh, it broke. Okay, that didn't work, right? Um, but we don't see that part necessarily because that's not what then gets presented. It's one of the reasons why there is this kind of interesting glitch as a practice and so forth, because often that's kind of trying to point to some of that. At the same time, I think we often forget with painting and sculpture and so forth, how many of those practices are very determined, right? The way in which they're constructed very carefully and executed very precisely by the artists. So, maybe technology is curious about these structures and is trying to help us be more aware of the structures that are there in all these different ways in our lives, um, but can wind up feeling dangerous or challenging to art when art overly identifies with its kind of expressionistic aspect. I'll leave it there, maybe.
Roddy, are you ready for your reading?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you
We're
for that. Sorry, I just was going to say thank
sorry.
you for the answer. I just really, yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, I feel like. Yes, I'm ready for the reading.
And we're also gonna send a link to these books in the chat so you can access them and read more into it later.
So yeah, there are actually two books that I thought I would just bring to the table today, and they happen to be two books that I kind of serendipitously read at the same time while I was on that sabbatical right before COVID. And the first one is "Capital is Dead. Is This Something Worse?" by Mackenzie Wark, and the second is "How to Speak Machine: Computational Thinking for the Rest of Us" by John Maeda. And I feel like something about reading these books simultaneously sort of opened up a new way of thinking about technology for me a little bit. So I'm just going to quickly read a little bit from Mackenzie Wark and then a little bit from John Maeda. That's cool. So Mackenzie Wark writes, and this is following a paragraph where she describes an Amazon kind of delivery warehouse with trucks and people moving boxes and all the stuff that we see on the news. Certainly, a lot of what just happened here could be called capitalism. Labor was corralled into factories and made to work long hours to make stuff. Other labor drove trucks or sat in call centers answering calls from irate users whose stuff did not arrive. But maybe there's something else here as well. Not just the exploitation of labor through the owning and controlling of the forces of production, but also the extraction of what you might call surplus information out of individual workers and consumers in order to build predictive models which further subordinate all activity to the same informational political economy. One where you are nothing but a user, and everything you do within hearing range of Alexis, or every movement you make with your cell phone, or everything you do on your laptop, or everything recorded of you or about you as you go about your daily life is captured by a vector and fed into computation to figure out how better to use you for the greater glory of Amazon, Google, Apple, or some other company owned and controlled by a new kind of ruling class the vectoralist class. To the vector, the spoils. And I will follow that with this short passage from John Maeda. If I can find it. You gave me so much opportunity to be prepared, man. I've completely squandered it. Um, Imagine the tech industry's cloud system floating above us, all as an endless array of eternally desiccated sponges that hydrate and get engorged with everything that can be gathered about what we do, where we are, and what we think. On the one hand, it can seem ominous, dark, and terrifying if you can't fathom what it's capable of doing, which is what most people are starting to feel. On the other hand, we might feel gratitude that there are data and ethics experts who have long been thinking through many of the issues so that we can start to distinguish between ethical and unethical sources of data collection. The computational world that was long invisible is becoming visible, and for us to fully trust it, we need it to be more transparent and understandable. We're no longer okay with opaque black boxes that we can neither look inside nor interrogate when they misbehave. We're still in the infancy of understanding what it means when the data owned by a credit card company can be completely anonymized and sold to a company like Google to be later de-anonymized by simply matching the credit card transactions to location information that's either broadcast by your smartphone or tagged by information you might share about yourself online. We're still at the point of infancy in grappling with what has been going on at worrying speeds that has long gone unnoticed. So.
Thank you, Roddy and Charlotte, for such an illuminating conversation. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. The donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation on Dirty and Disorderly, Contemporary Artists Undiscussed at Massmoca. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye. Say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Hello and
Hello
goodbye.
and goodbye. Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Roddy. Thank you,
Charlotte.
Charlotte.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a good
Wow,
one, you
just
all.
got back
Thanks
in
again.
time. I will
Yay.
listen to it later. Thank you.
Bye.
Keep up the good work, Roddy.
Hey, thanks, Mom.
Ciao, you guys.
Love you
Thank you.
too.